I just wanted to start by acknowledging very much the Institute and thanking especially Taylor McBride for seeing this book to fruition. It's a very long road that this has taken. I started working on this site in 2002. It's like shocking amount of time, nearly a quarter of a century. And so this is a really big deal for me that this has come out in a full monograph form. And there's I was just telling my sister-in-law, my brother and my niece are here as well, which is great. And I was just telling my sister-in-law, there's very few presses that still do these kind of very data-rich, very detailed books. And so we do one, but of course to get tenure, I couldn't have published it in my own. So they were like, what about the Cotsen? I was like, yeah, the Cotsen. And so it's been a real journey, but I really do appreciate it, Taylor. You've done an unbelievable job with this book. And the Cotsen Press has been a real pleasure to work with. So I just wanted to highlight some of the kind of main findings. I can't go through all of it. It's a very, very detailed book on a single site. It is a very special site, and it has a huge amount of potential. And I just kind of wanted to give you a flavor of the kind of things that we can do at a site like this, which is really quite an unusual one. So I'll introduce the sort of topic and what it speaks to. I'll talk about the site. I'll introduce the different categories of material culture and fauna and everything. We'll go through the materials and methods of what I did in the study. I'll talk a little bit about sources of inference, which are quite important for the kind of inferences that we can draw and hypotheses that we can try to test with the data. I'll just look at some results, sort of some of the prime kind of take-home results, and then wrap up with some conclusions. And I apologize, it will go over because we got a late start. So hunter-gatherer residential or domestic campsites form in a very real way the very core of human sociality. Their significance came to really be realized in the middle of the 20th century with the activation of what were assumed to be living floors. These were sort of unproblematically assumed to be single campsites, but these were archaeological sites. We now know many of them were palimpsest, or mixtures of materials from different ages. Famous sites like FLK and DK at Olduvai Gorge, excavated by the Leakeys, Colombo Falls in Zambia, excavated by Desmond Clark, and then, of course, Glenn Isaac's work at Kubifora and Orligosaile. It was Glenn Isaac who first pointed out that only humans accumulate trash by repeatedly bringing foraged food and materials back to central places in the landscape, and he hypothesized that social interactions that occurred at such places gave rise to a whole suite of behaviors that undergird the evolution of culture, and that includes things like structured food sharing and the sexual division of labor. We now know that those kind of facets of human culture only developed later, probably quite a bit less, or maybe slightly less than about 500,000 years ago. Not millions of years ago, like Glenn Isaac was originally hypothesizing back in the 1960s and 70s. And the famous Kalahari ethnographies from which he and others drew inspiration, however, did show that contemporary hunter-gatherer campsites are extraordinarily social places, to the point of, in many cases, directly reflecting kinship links in the layout of their domestic structures. So this is a kind of a famous map from John Yellen's seminal book in the late 70s, showing that you can basically reconstruct full kinship relationships and how people in a given band are related to one another by just looking at their proximity of their domestic structures to one another. They are direct, unproblematic reflections of the kinship network. Now, that's not always the case. This is actually kind of an idealized case in particular areas at particular seasons, and there's all sorts of things that can muddle this. But nonetheless, these are highly structured and very, very social places. And much more recently, evolutionary anthropologists, biological anthropologists are showing how domestic campsites and the social linkages they engender are the core components of a modular nested social network structure shared by all small-scale hunter-gatherer societies. And this is basically a recognition that hunter-gatherer networks are basically small worlds, that the small-scaleness of hunter-gatherers is not particularly small scale, that their network structure is basically a highly adaptive structure that simultaneously maximizes information generation and transmission, and that lays the groundwork for the evolution of cumulative culture, for which our species is so well known, and to other extents probably also characterize late living species of other species of the genus Homo as well. And so at the very core of that is the campsite, is the residential or domestic campsite of the hunter-gatherer. The thing is, when all of this was sort of taking off in the 1960s, 1970s, in the middle part of the 20th century, the academic milieu was inherently economic and ecological. There was a very strong functionalist and adaptationist concern of Western scholars, and that informed the data that they recorded, and especially the questions asked of their informants, their ethnographic informants, whether about a choice of where to camp, or why certain things were done in certain places, or why certain places or things were avoided, etc. What to Western eyes were rational explanations grounded in optimizing returns over all other concerns were assumed to drive hunter-gatherer decisions. So informants, ethnographic informants, hunter-gatherers in the Kalahari, for instance, were not asked about their real motives on their own terms, and with few exceptions, justifications that invoked especially religious belief or ritual practice or other elements of ideology or worldview were downplayed or outright dismissed. On the archaeological side, scholars like Lewis Binford famously searched for regularly occurring ecological patterns in the ways hunter-gatherers structured both domestic space and broader movements across landscapes, and the variables that conditioned them. He was using ethno-archaeological insights from hunter-gatherer communities in the interior of Alaska, and he began differentiating and classifying different site types, so things like short-term residential camps, long-term residential camps, kill sites, butchery sites, and so on. He didn't himself care much about sacred sites or ritual sites. He thought worldview was sort of extraneous and not inherently adaptive, which we now, or at least I think it very much is. But others who followed his lead classified them as separate site types. So in addition to things like kill sites and butchery sites, you have sacred sites, right? You have ritual sites out there, out in the landscape. These are not what happens in here in the domestic place. So these were all sort of different site types in a topology spanning across a landscape. And one of the key points this evening that I'd like to make is that there's much more to hunter-gatherer decision-making than dispassionate subsistence choices, that ritual and religion deeply influence decision-making, and that these practices can and most often do, contrary to what Binford and others thought, occur not in special places, but rather within domestic campsites or residential sites themselves. On the other side, the kind of run away from the kind of Binfordian and ecological economic paradigm has seen very much a very sharp pendulum swing in the other direction, much more particularizing, essentializing perspectives, trying to eschew law-like, the search for law-like sort of conditions of hunter-gatherers and looking at what governs hunter-gatherer behavior and makes things similar to hyper-particularism or diversity, right? Looking at historical changes and post-colonial types of approaches that really look at regional specificity in how hunter-gatherers adapt. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong. I think that this is kind of almost a natural progression. The field, lots of social science and humanities work in the same way, following trends in the discipline. But one thing I would like to argue, and I can't get into it too much, and I'm sort of now writing stuff about this, is I think that the study of hunter-gatherer ontology or worldview can act as a bridge between a particularizing hunter-gatherer model or set of theories and the kind of older adaptationist ecological ones. And I'm trying to push something that actually was sort of in a nascent form originally hit upon by Roy Rappaport at Michigan. He called it Cosmo something crazy. He called it eco-cosmology. And myself and colleagues are calling it ecological ontology, and it's ontology from an adaptationist point of view. And I think it's important because ontologies, ritual and religion, worldview are actually quite stable systems. They don't change as much as even things like language and styles and artifacts, and these things come and go, but ritual and religion have staying power. And they span over large amounts of space. And so actually they allow us to access and make inferences about deep time change in the past. And they kind of can straddle this sweet spot between particularizing regional approaches and some larger, maybe not as large as Binford envisaged, which I don't think was very helpful, but some larger amounts of space and time. And they get us away from these essentializing narratives around behavioral ecology and optimizing features, which when you actually ask hunter-gatherers themselves, or if you're able to look at the ethnographic record and you have a rich ethnographic record or ethnohistoric record like we do in Southern Africa, you can see that their choices are not determined by what's going on in their stomach purely. There's all sorts of other things happening. And even if it is about what's going on in their stomach, which it sometimes or often is, there's no easy workaround in the way that Western scholars might think there is. There's no easy route. There's things that have to be negotiated in the landscape. And those things have to do with with being animistic religious people. And I'm not saying animism is a religion. It's not. It's a word to describe multiple different kinds of religions, but they all share essential characteristics. One is that there's no Cartesian duality between the sacred and the secular. So everyday, daily life, even the most mundane things are shot through with religious importance for animistic hunter-gatherer people. Souls are the same and only the bodies differ, right? So when you die, your soul goes up somewhere and you might re-inhabit something that's not a human later on in another lifetime. And so by extension, trees and rivers and rocks and glaciers and animals are persons. They're not human persons, but they're persons, just like you and I are. And because they're persons, we can have kinship with them. You can have kinship networks with them. So these are distributed kinship networks, and they're very serious. I mean, these are not like, sort of like, you and I know it's not really a person, right? No, for them, they are people. So as with humans, non-human kin relations must be negotiated and maintained. Agency is not unique to humans. This is critical. Non-human persons have agency too. They can act upon you. They can act upon you positively if they dig you and you've done nice things. They can act upon you very negatively if you're not doing nice things in their eyes or you're acting disrespectfully. There's continuity between live beings and their remains, right? So animal bones still have the essence and the agency of the animal inside them, and they can act against you. And if you're disrespectful to the bone, you're not going to get your next kill because the animal knows, because the bone, the essence of the animal, is still inside the bone, for instance. And that even transitions to artifacts made from those tissues, right? So your animal bone arrow point has the essence of the animal that you might have killed it with, killed it with another arrow, and it's still there. So the respectful treatment of waste is paramount for hunter-gatherers, especially animal remains and artifacts made from them. And if you look at the ethnographies that did consider these issues in the 1960s and 70s, and there's very few of them, they are uniformly agreed on this point. Whether it's a Cree, Mistassini Cree in Canada, Australian Aboriginal people, whether it's Southern African hunter-gatherer, San hunter-gatherer, it doesn't matter. This is something that unites animistic worldviews. And there is some interesting linguistic data to suggest that animistic worldviews and animistic religions are the oldest. They're the most common. They occur in 100% of living hunter-gatherer cultures are animistic, more than belief in afterlife, shamanism, etc. Shamanism is a part of animism often, but not always. But animism is 100%, according to this quite influential study by Peoples et al. So it has importance for how we interpret the archaeological record, especially of our species. And I think that animism probably evolved a long time ago. I don't know when, but that's one of the questions. That's one of the really interesting questions. And I want to try to make a case that I think that hunter-gatherer campsites, the mundane campsites, because they're no longer mundane if we take it seriously, if we take the ontological turn seriously, everything's spiritual. So they're no longer mundane. And those are the arenas where we can access some of these things. Okay, so that was a very long intro, I'm sorry. Okay, Dunefield Midden. So one of the issues is finding the right sites to do it. And I think here we have one of those sites. And they're very uncommon, because especially with hunter-gatherer archaeology and kind of deep time Paleolithic archaeology, where there's all sorts of preservational and taphonomic issues working against us. A lot of these sites are in caves and rock shelters where rats burrow down and roots come up and all sorts of shit happens, and it's a mess. And usually, again, these are palimpsested sites, time averaged, and you can't extricate the individual events out from the mass. You just are left with a whole series of events that make up a layer or some kind of stratigraphic unit, and you have to deal with an averaging effect. And so you don't really know that you're dealing with any particular campsite occupation versus another, right? And that's an issue because hunter-gatherers live in real time. They have forever, right? I mean, they're people. And so in order to understand relationships between people and relationships between people and non-human persons, we need to make sure that we're all dealing with the same stuff that was deposited at the same time. And with time average deposits, that's obviously not possible. At Dunefield Midden, we have quite a particular case. This is in Elands Bay in South Africa. It's about 200 kilometers north of Cape Town. Where is it? Yeah, it's the red triangle there. Cape Town's right here. If we zoom in a little bit further, you see this is Elands Bay here and this larger St. Helena Bay. All the bays are these kind of scallop bays that dot the or carve the kind of west coast of South Africa. The climate's very similar to here in Los Angeles, a little bit drier, but quite similar. I feel like a weatherman suddenly. It's quite weird. Here's a large pressure, low pressure system. And there's a whole bunch of sites. It's a very interesting Middle and later Stone Age landscape. It's a beautiful area. Dunefield Midden itself is aptly named because it's in this very large, it's at the kind of foot of this large, partially transgressive, in other words, partially still mobile, but partially stationary because there's all this nasty Australian-derived scrub that's invasive and come in, and it's sort of in that area, but it would have been more exposed in the past. Here's a view from near the site, looking back at Baboon Point here, where you've got Elands Bay Cave, a very famous kind of key site in the region. Just an aerial photographer view of the high transgressive Dunefield, and then you can see this kind of more sort of looks like TV fuzz, this area where this invasive brush has come in, and Dunefield Midden is sort of in that brush, and it's hunkered against this Holocene dune cordon, this kind of linear dune feature that provides shelter from wind, and the site's sort of hunkered up against it. It's in these sort of so-called hummock dunes. These are invasive, but they would have looked like this with this kind of very nice sort of heat and sun-adapted succulent vegetation, cam vegetation. This is just what the site looks like today. You know, looks like a sand dune. I mean, it doesn't, you know. This is the problem with Paleolithic sites. You're like, oh, you should have seen that hearth. It was so beautiful. Now it's gone, of course, so you can't see anything, but it was so nice. You know, so anyway, that's a nice view from the Dunefield from across at Elands Bay Cave. Just get a sense of the environment. But the cool thing about it is hunter-gatherers camped there, and I'm going to talk about the dates and stuff, and they left, and as soon as they left, apparently, the winds picked up and just covered the site in this very fine aeolian sand, this white sand. And the nice thing is they were camping on a surface that's not the white sand. They were camping on an older water lane, not aeolian, but water lane beach surface of this yellowish sand. And so the archaeologist, it was excavated by John Parkinson, who's a professor at the University of Cape Town, over the course of 12 years by him and colleagues and students of his from 1988 to 2000. And because it had this nice sort of contact, they were able to trace that archaeology very beautifully across a very large horizontal extent. And for a small-scale hunter-gatherer, small scale as in society, hunter-gatherer site, it's one of the largest in the world. So they were able to excavate 860 square meters of space over the course of 12 years. Square meter by square meter, plotting as much as they could in the fine sand. It was difficult to find absolutely everything, so a lot of it had to be sieved, and they found a lot. So it's about half of the material we now know was plotted, which I think is actually pretty good given the conditions, and given that it was the 80s and 90s when that wasn't entirely common everywhere. It is now, and something else. I can't remember what I was saying. Anyway. So very cool site, so very, very large scale. Just to give you a sense, so it's got the 10-meter grid, and these are each 1 square meters, but so you just see that you've got this, just one example of a 10 square meter, and they numbered it from the north, so that's north is pointing that way, the sea's over here, sort of more comfortable to orient it like this, and they, from the north east corner, they start with 1, and the squares they number, and they get to 10, and they go back 11 to 20, 21, et cetera. Anyway, just to give you an idea about how the grid is set up. The preservation is nuts. It's amazing. Unfortunately, the botanical remains are basically blown out. They blew away because it's a heavy coastal environment with lots of wind. There was tons of charcoal, though, so it would, you know, for some reason the charcoal stayed. I think it was more cemented because of the ash and stuff usually that's on top of it. But there's this incredible number of features. Features just, you know, archaeological burning events or dumping events or other kinds of things like that. And there's 114 of these things that create kind of the bones of the skeleton of this site. Different kinds of features. There's hearths. These are confidence levels. They're coded by a high confidence is sort of a solid line, medium is sort of dashed, and then low is speckled. You don't have to worry about any of that. But there's hearths, there's ashy patches, there's these big crusted features, which are these massive blue things, which are crusted shellfish features and burned, probably for a some kind of shellfish processing or maybe feasting type of features. There's roasting platforms. There's 2 of those, and they're surrounded by whale barnacles. My sister-in-law loves barn. Anyway, it's a joke, private joke. Whale barnacles. So they were roasting whale meat on those. Even though the meat is, or there's no bone, we know that those barnacles are specific to those particular kinds of whales, the southern right whales. So we know that they were cooking whale meat. Ash dumps, roasting pits, charcoal and ash pits, mongoose burials. These will become important later on. These are ritualized mongoose burials, of which there's 7 in these sort of 3 clusters, these sort of yellow dots here. In terms of the actual structure of the site, you've got what has been interpreted as a kind of broad arc of a domestic zone, mostly hearths. The hearths have very small debris, both food waste and napping, stone tool napping debris around them, so kind of very sort of drop zone-y in the Binfordian sense. Very clearly high confidence hearths with other satellite hearths around them, probably used at other times of day when it was getting too windy. You moved to the other side of the shelter that would have been around these, or for other reasons, for cooking a snack, for whatever reason, your mom's annoying you and you want to move away or whatever. So kind of domestic zone that spans this whole eastern part of the site. Again, north is that way, away from the sea. You've got this sort of really weird hearth complex up here that I'm going to talk about. It's quite prominent in my work and very interesting. It's a bit overprinted by shell remains here, which is also quite interesting. And then you've got this massive area of shellfish, mostly shellfish remains, called the main dump, that's on top of, in varying densities, this whole morass of different kinds of features, mostly hearths, but also processing, lots of processing features, dump features, different kinds of cooking features, these big crusted ash features, and all this roasting pits and all this kind of stuff. So you've got this kind of bilateral symmetry of an eastern domestic area and a kind of western dump area with this sort of confusing southern overprinted zone down here at the southern terminus of the site. I'm just going to take a drink. The dating is unbelievably tight. There's 27 radiocarbon dates, charcoal, and shellfish. And it's just, they're statistically indistinguishable. And I know many of you guys are archaeologists. That never happens, ever. I mean, I don't know of a single other case where that has happened that I've read. It is so weird to have every single date you submit come back basically the same. And not only that, so we've got very positive skew on the duration, meaning that the skew of these dates is verging more towards 0 years than the opposite end. So this is, again, very, very suggestive of something that happened more or less at the same time, at least in terms of radiocarbon. So it's within the bounds of the probability distribution of a radiocarbon set of ages. But it doesn't mean that the site was all deposited at the exact same moment. And that's kind of an important distinction I'll make a little later on. If we look at the distribution of where these dates, so these are the charcoal dates, these are the shell dates, there's no pattern. It's not like there's a time transgressive pattern where the site is clearly moving from one old. So this is the kind of hot colors are younger and the colder colors are older. And you can see in both cases they're all over the show. And what that's showing again is that the site is deposited at a time envelope that is below the detection of the radiocarbon method, and strongly suggestive of it happening at roughly the same time. Again, whether that's a single occupation over X number of weeks or months, or a couple occupations spaced over a year, 2 years, 3, we can't detect that. But I have a hunch, and I make the case in the book, that it is several occupations, as I'll talk about, on top of each other. So the dates are statistically indistinguishable, suggestive of a single occupation on multiple closely spaced. The mean ages of the dates falls within the 4 decades of 1340 to 1380. This is a recent site. This is not an ancient Paleolithic site. This is only about 700 years old. But what makes it incredible is not its antiquity. What makes it incredible is its preservation and the conditions under which it was excavated. So it's very tightly dated to this sort of 40-year period in the middle of the 14th century AD. Occupied during the Little Ice Age, in the early part of the Little Ice Age, which is the fate of widespread global cooling. And this area, which now is, again, quite hot and dry, would have been cooler, better watered, and kind of just generally nicer place to live. So this is a kind of a nice place to be in this part of the world. The seasonality data are quite good at the site. We've got data from seal mandible measurements and these little guys, these hyraxes. You know these guys? Related to the elephant? Everyone knows hyraxes. So weird, so annoying as well. Like really more annoying than marmots, which is impressive because marmots I thought were the highest pitch, but these guys have them beat. So this is dental eruption data on marmot. I'm not going to get into the details here, but the excavator, the main PI of the site, John Parkington, and his colleague Jack Fisher, who's at Montana State, did just fantastic work really pinning down the seasonality data. And basically the main story between the two proxies is that there's a peak occupation in July, August, southern hemisphere, so that's winter. And then there's tails going either way, so into the late fall earlier, and then later into the early spring. So late fall to early spring with a peak sometime in the winter, okay? It's hard to get more precise than that. We've got kind of a 6 to 7 month sort of window, but we can say it's not a summer occupation, which makes sense because it would have been a hot, dry, and fairly waterless place to hang out, even in the Little Ice Age. It's only 1,000 years old or so, and by that time, Neolithic lifeways and technologies had moved somehow into southern Africa. There's massive debates for regional specialists as to how this went down and when, but at some point, San hunter-gatherers obtained, and either there was an episode, a quite short episode of kind of almost ethnogenesis resulting from, or they obtained through kind of diffusion and simply exchange and trade, things like pottery and domesticated animals. At first, they were the small domesticates like sheep and goats, later joined by cattle. And these are from pastoralist people from East Africa who themselves had gotten these from these Bantu migrations, which began at about 6,000 years ago, moving across the Great Lakes region of Africa and providing livestock, not pottery, because they already had that, but livestock to East Africans, and then East African groups coming down and interacting with San hunter-gatherer people, who then in turn moved with those animals down, either in a migration of pastoralists that eventually would become the historical Khoikhoi, so famously documented by the Dutch colonists in the beginning of the 17th century, or more likely it seems that early on there was a diffusion of the goods amongst resident hunter-gatherers, exchanging through pre-existing social networks, pottery, sheep, and goats, followed about 1,000 years ago by a demic diffusion, in other words, a migration of a Khoikhoi-speaking, Khoi-Kwadi-speaking people with cattle. So this looks like a two-phase thing. It'll become important a little later in the talk. I'm trying to go fast. Faunal remains and material culture, not going to dwell. Do you like my pictures of animals? I hope so. I spent some time on that. Anyway, so you can't read this, but it's incredibly rich site, very opportunistic, shore-centered, in other words, a shore-tethered resource base. Lots of fish, tons and tons of shellfish. Got some more barnacles here for Allie. Lots of species of shellfish in crazy, this is 2,442,761 grams of shellfish. So just giant amounts of shellfish that has begun to really piss off the museum down in Cape Town because they have to curate all this stuff. And then we've got the main sort of animals are a huge amount of seals. There's 87 individual seals at the site. That's a lot of seal. And these are big Cape fur seals. There's 9 eland. Eland are the world's largest antelope. Elands stand like, 9. So the amount of meat, lots of different kinds of smaller antelopes. I'm going to be talking about those. There's sheep, of course, as I talked about a minute ago. There's small carnivores. There's dogs. We know they're dogs from DNA that's been done on them. And there's various other things. And then there's all this other stuff that hasn't really even been analyzed. There's tons of fish, shorebirds. There's tortoise. I'm going to talk about these guys. Ostrich eggshell, we'll spend a little time on those guys. They're quite important for the study. Cape crayfish, which are basically lobster, big things, frogs, lizards, all sorts of stuff. Material culture, there's stone tools. I stayed away from these because they're quartz and it's horrible to work with, and other people were doing it, thank God. But these are quartz crystal mostly backed In other words, dulled along one side, probably for mounting end on end in these kind of composite tools, maybe for butchery of seals and other kind of meat. So actually quite interesting, but difficult to analyze, so, and impossible to refit. So I wasn't so interested in those. Ceramics, by this time, again, there's ceramics down there, bone tools, ostrich eggshell fragments. So I'm going to talk about these guys, and tortoiseshell bowls. These are tortoiseshell carapaces that have been ground along the periphery to make bowls. Ostrich eggshell beads, and then other ornaments of various kinds as well. I'm going to try to, in the book I test 3 hypotheses, and so here I kind of wanted to focus on these for the results that I talk about. And again, I'm just giving you sort of a smattering of some of the bigger take-home messages. One is that John Parkington had hypothesized that this was a very brief, ephemeral site that just represented a couple weeks in the lives of these hunter-gatherers, like 2 to 3 weeks, and then they were gone. Okay, and he thinks the entire site is a single contemporaneous occupation. Okay, so that's one thing to test, which we can do with our data. Another that he also thought was that DFM's inhabitants were hunter-gatherers, that there was no herder influence. He has a model that when herders came into that landscape, that they had quite strained relationships with local hunter-gatherers because of competition between domesticated animals and wild fauna. And he had all sorts of ethnohistorical reasons for thinking that. But that, again, that model now has broken down given the fact that we know there was a 2-part introduction of herders, and that there's a lot less difficulty transitioning from hunter-gatherer to herder from various ethnographic case studies around the world. So we can sort of look at this as well with the data. And then something I'm particularly interested in and sort of began the talk with, which is whether we can infer aspects of ritual practice from the domestic spatial patterning at the site. Okay, so the materials that I looked at were not everything, because that would have taken a lifetime or more, but I looked at a specific series of terrestrial resources of food waste. So this is bone and shell, not shellfish, but the shells of tortoises and the eggshells of ostriches. So 3 different size bovids, eland, oops, I switched those, I'm sorry. Everything is screwed up here. Wow, okay. Eland, small antelopes like Griesbach and Steenbach, and then fat-tailed sheep. So just ignore those titles. Ungulate tortoises and ostrich eggs. And then on the artifact side, I analyzed ceramics, reconstructed all these different ceramic vessels, and then tortoise carapace bowls and ostrich eggshell flasks. And these two, the last 2 container types, these are all 3 different containers, inorganic in this case of ceramic, obviously, and organic. And these are interesting because they straddle the boundary between food waste and artifacts. So they're kind of funky. And so I'll just spend a second just briefly just to give you an idea. So these are tortoises and ostrich eggshells, and the whole idea here is that these things move through their lives, and they always have possibilities of discard of fragments as they transition from being a foodstuff to artifacts. In the case of ostrich eggshells, they become water flasks. The hole that you drill to take the egg out becomes the canteen mouth. They're deodorized, and they're cleaned, and they're perfect water containers. They're strong. They're only about 1 liter, so they're portable. They're really like canteens. You can stop them up and bury them under the ground so they don't evaporate in dry environments, and you can collect them later when you're in waterless terrain. And they're genius things. And we now know they have a history going back for colleagues of mine excavating. We've got them at 70,000 years ago, but then a colleague of mine, of course, had to find a flask mouth showing that they were making these things at 90,000. So annoying. So annoying. 90. Why couldn't you just give me a year? No, 90. And then, of course, once they break, they make ostrich eggshell beads out of them, right? And there's always, movement into the archaeological record or through their life. And the same thing with tortoises. They eat them, they put them straight on the coals, and they take off the plastron, and you've got basically like a cup of soup. It's quite grim, but bear with me. The plastrons are discarded. The carapaces can be discarded, or they might be made into bowls. And then the broken ones stay on site, or they're brought off site. And the same thing with ostrich eggshell flasks. These things last about 2 years in the Kalahari, we know. So they have a long use life, like about the same as pottery. Anyway, just gives you an idea. The other cool thing about these, just again, this one case of these organic containers, is that they're in the Kalahari, they're frequently used for the same tasks. So, the tortoiseshell bowls are used to whip up these massive omelets and then pour them onto these preheated sort of sediment griddles. And then you get this massive omelet, so after they're, no longer food, but they become an artifact, they dip the water out of the springs and they pour the water into them, right? And then these are the kind of containers, the medicine containers that create the smoke to help healers go into trance, or that hold powerful sort of medicinal powder that women use, these kind of cosmetic boxes, often are decorated with tassels of ostrich eggshell beads. So there's lots of interplay between ostrich and tortoise, and as I'll talk about later, that's interesting because these are thought of as ontologically linked. They're both things of the rain. They're things of the water god in San religion, Kwa, and they're parts of his domain. And so that's going to be interesting when we start to interrogate some of the pattern in just a little bit. In terms of what I did with these is I refit them. They were all broken, and then I put them together. So this is a totally masochistic exercise that I don't recommend to anyone. I mean, really, no, don't do it. It's bad. It took me 2 years. Tons of different bones of the animals. I was doing mechanical refitting, we're literally putting two things together. I was doing anatomical refitting, so looking at statistical matches of articulations or bilateral pairs, right? Using stats. Obviously with the ceramics and ostrich eggshell and tortoises, it's only mechanical. I was just putting them together. And then doing a whole series of different kinds of geostatistical analyses, like hotspot analysis, kernel density, ring buffer, Poisson, standard distance. This has all become easier. When I was doing this, it was a pain in the butt to do a lot of this, but with ArcGIS now, it's made a lot easier. So for the book, when I redid a lot of these analyses with more data, it was like fantastic and much easier than it was back in 20 years ago when I started doing this. So that was a thankful situation. And the idea basically is to try to get at socio-spatial dynamics via the daily subsistence cycle. The idea that subsistence, hunting, gathering, processing, sharing, cooking, sharing secondarily, eating is cyclical, and there's always chance for damage, breakage, or discard at various points. And we're trying to use those different kinds of residues to reconstruct not just the subsistence cycle, but how people interacted with one another through space, with each other, and with with non-human persons as well through the campsite. Sort of the idea. So sources of interest are important, I think, because a lot of archaeologists, and I'm sure you guys will appreciate this, certainly I think Jason will, draw very heavily on ethnoarchaeology and ethnography done when the discipline was formalized, right? So, no earlier than the 50s, really, because, that wasn't really real ethnography, and it's systematic, and these are trained anthropologists, and it's, from the 60s that really. But the problem is, again, like as I began, they were always asking questions that maybe weren't really the concerns of the people that they were trying to get information from. They were asking questions that concerned them, that they thought were important. They weren't saying, for you, what's the important thing? What do I need to know? They were saying, I know what's important, and I'm going to ask you questions about what I perceive to be important about your life, right? So they got a very, very partial picture. And so to try to step away from that and expand, and again, I'm not trying to deny the importance, because this is the baseline data that has the first pass to understand the data has been these phenomenal, especially Kalahari archaeological records. But then when they don't match, they don't, what do you do, right? And so that was the thing, was trying to figure out what can I do. And so moving beyond that in time, going earlier to previous contact episodes was the kind of key. One of those was the ethnohistoric record of early Dutch and English colonizers in this area. These are inherently racist and extremely ethnocentric, biased Europeanist records, so they can't just be used as if these are professional anthropologists. They're not, but they have tons of amazing and useful information in them if you can try to correct for some of those biases. Sometimes it can't be corrected for, but they should not be ignored. They're absolutely gems. And so that was one thing that I mined very heavily. And the most important was historical ethnography, or ethnography done in the 20th century, in the 19th century, before a lot of the colonial, before the heaviest toll of the colonial program had affected the indigenous people of southern Africa. It was happening, the genocide was occurring, but they were still more or less intact in some ways culturally. And there's been some really interesting discussions around the Kalahari ethnographies being obviously very, very interesting and so on, but actually Kalahari people having had so much interaction with Western folks at that, and such a terrible time in all sorts of different ways in the colonial context, that they've become kind of de-spiritualized. They become sort of disenchanted, has been the word. And so they no longer they don't have as much animistic tendencies and general thought as their predecessors, both in the Kalahari, but especially just as historical circumstances would be, these folks here, which were in the Karoo Desert to the south of the Kalahari in the interior of South Africa, these are Kham individuals, these are Southern San, speak very different language to the Kalahari folks. And this is an incredible, I don't have time to go into it, but there was a German linguist who came to originally study sort of Bantu or Isian-2 languages like Zulu and Xhosa and stuff from Germany back in the 1870s. And he started hearing these clicks in these languages. And he was like, what is going on with these clicks? Where'd they come from? People were like, oh, they got those from the Bushmen. Like, who are the Bushmen? And then he moved to Cape Town, moved his family to Cape Town to try to be near some of these, because he knew that a lot of these people being exterminated, rounded up, straight up genocide in the interior from Afrikaner farmers and the Boer trekkers. They were being imprisoned on all sorts of false pretenses and shipped off to Cape Town and made to do hard manual labor at especially the Breakwater prison before Robben Island became re-outfitted as a prison. And he managed to persuade the jail warden to house these people at his house. These are San hunter-gatherer in Victorian South Africa, basically English Victorian South Africa, San hunter-gatherers, prisoners, right? These people by the public were considered not human. They were considered savage and base level. And then these are also criminals, right? I mean, they weren't, but criminals to boot. And he managed to have them come live with him so he could study first their language, but once they learned the language, he and his sister-in-law named Lucy Lloyd, his name is didn't tell you his name, Wilhelm Blake, B-L-E-E-K, Blake, and Lucy Lloyd, his sister-in-law, who became fascinated as well, was very good with languages. Once they decoded the Kham language, they just started listening to these guys and they thought, this is the most incredible stuff they've ever heard. The incredibly rich mythology, unbelievably rich folk tales, just a stupendous cosmology and ontology that was coming out of these people as they spoke, let alone all the violence they'd been subjected to and so on. And so they spent years, and then their daughter actually became one of the proto-ethnographers before all the Kalahari Harvard expedition and before the Marshall family. There was Dorothea Blake, who is the daughter of Wilhelm and her sister. So this is one of the untold, this is the single most important ethnographic corpus I think we have from Southern Africa. And I mean, it's a bit controversial, but I might even say, including the Kalahari, like this stuff is so amazing. And it's massive. They filled 11 or 12 big, 1,000 massive pages of information. Anyway, so very, very important. And a lot of our understanding of the animist underpinnings of San worldview are coming out of this Blake and Lloyd archive and record that's curated permanently and digitized at the University of Cape Town. Oh my God, okay, sorry, how am I doing with time? Oh, okay, well, not great, okay. Okay, so very quick results. I got some conclusions and then we'll call it. So what did all this add up to? What's the point? Okay, so let's take the questions one by one. Oh God, that's so small, sorry. Okay. Was DFM occupied once for a few weeks? The answer is no. No. The answer is no. And why do I say that? There's all sorts of different lines of evidence. I'm just going to present a few. One is the ceramic refits. So this is a tiny little map that you probably can't see of all the different refits and all the lines. I managed to connect different bits of pottery together. And the point of this, again, this is so hard for you to see, but the point of this is to show just taking the largest and most well-reconstructed vessel. This is a pot about this big, very nice thing. Just to show that basically this pot, the way it broke, was in a phased manner. So the neck of this pot is way down here in the dump. The midsection of the pot is over here in the dump. And the base of the pot is lying in this little nest, like this little beautiful nest right next to this domestic hearth. So this thing was breaking over the time of this site occupation and being dumped sequentially in different areas of the site. And that nice little base was left because it was still useful when the people were going to come back, or it was discarded because it was towards the end of an occupation. These things last for 2 years in the Kalahari. I'm not saying that people were occupying this for 2 years, but a couple weeks, that's disastrously bad luck for a couple weeks. Moreover, you've got one of the cool things is you've got these little tiny pieces that do not occur in these 3 areas, but occur very tightly associated with other hearths. And so we can see the use contexts, not just the one with the base, but other hearths where this thing was actually used. And that's going to become important in just a second. This is just one pot. There were 25 of these. So there's just again, just a little bit of patterning. These are bovid foot bones versus anvils. So this is important because this allows us to identify where animals were butchered, because when animals are brought into the site, their feet, the metapodials, are cut off, and they're cracked for marrow right on the spot, because that marrow is really, really good, and it gives the people a bit of energy to go through with the butchery. That's a very common thing to do in the Kalahari and among other San people. And they crack those things on anvils. They crack open the cannon bones, the marrow bones, on anvils in order to eat the marrow. And so if you have piles of foot bones and you have anvils in association, and we ran some nice stats using Poisson tests, you come up with these areas of definite either large or small bovid butchery. And what this allows us to do is look at areas where consuming things happened using pots and other things, and areas where animals were butchered. And so these are primary use contexts of either butchery or the cooking that just followed it. And what we can see basically is that between the southern and the northern part of the site, there's a very clear and redundant pattern where the cooking and processing is happening in a core area overlapping a dump, and then you're getting this kind of arc of cooking and consumption. Processing and dumping, animal processing and then dumping after is happening there. So processing is happening here. That meat, that uncooked meat, is moving out to this peripheral zone, being cooked and consumed, and then it's being redeposited as dumped waste here. Not always, because there's some really important, this dumping ritual pile I'll talk about later, that's very important, but you're getting this thing, and the same thing's happening on the other side. We're processing, moving out, and cooking, and coming back in for disposal. And so what you can see is that the site has 2 basically redundant structures, one on top of the other, right? And I think that what that's showing quite clearly is that this is 2 occupations, not 1. It's at least 2 that are on top of each other. It just looks like 1 because this occupation, which I think happened first, was then covered over by all the dump stuff from this occupation. So that stuff's, and that's the reason for this big southern overprinted zone as well. So anyway, it's complex. I don't know whether this happened because it just got a little bit too nasty over here, so they were like, let's just move here. Or if this happened like later in the year or maybe the next year. I tend to go with the latter. And that's because some of the other patterning is suggestive of 2 really rather different seasons happening. So this is the ceramic vessel refits. So these are vessel sets. So these sort of convex hulls or polygons surround entire vessels of refits. These are the ceramics versus the ostrich eggshell. And you can see that there's a massive difference in frequency between the southern site where you have most of the ceramics being based and the northern part of the site where you have most of the ostrich eggshell being based. And what I think is happening is that this southern area was occupied first during a full wintertime occupation when boiling, when seal rendering would have been a very important activity. These seals wash up when they're exhausted in the winter storms, when they're yearlings. So these are seal pups. They wash up and they're all over the place, and they're an amazing sort of fat and protein. And so you would have been boiling that blubber down, and you would have been making soups and all sorts of stuff like that. And so you've got this very nice sort of wintertime occupational signal. And then as it goes on into spring and it's getting hotter and warmer, that ostrich eggshell water containers become more important and more to the fore. And the people move to the northern part of the site, and they're drinking more water. That water is retaining with them on site, and those are breaking more commonly because they're being used more commonly at the site, if that makes sense. That's my hypothesis about site occupation. Were they pure hunter-gatherers? Were these pure San hunter-gatherers like John Parkington would have us believe, or were these Khoikhoi pastoralists, or were they some other thing? And one other thing they might be are these weird strandlopers. These were recorded by various European colonial people. These people that inhabit the shoreline, very tethered to the shoreline, And they're weird because they don't really speak San languages. They look like San, but then they all look very similar. I mean, the Khoi and the San look identical, except the Khoi are on average a little bit taller. They're basically very similar people. Then you've got these other people that are hunter-gatherers. They're short like the other hunter-gatherers, but they speak Khoi languages, which freaked the Europeans out. They couldn't figure that out. And sometimes they have domesticated animals, and sometimes they don't. And sometimes they work for the Khoi, and sometimes they don't. And when asked about the other hunter-gatherers, they say, no, we don't like them. They're not our kin. So this is all kind of flashing red alarms to me that DFM is possibly something to do with these guys, right? But the thing is that these guys got put to bed as basically the idea of the strandlopers got very forcefully refuted as being its own thing in the 1980s by a very prominent scholar who said, no, this is a colonial, just racist moniker. They didn't know what the hell they're talking about. These are San. There's two kinds of people, San and Khoi pastoralists. And strandlopers are San. They have nothing to do with these guys. Well, okay, but I don't know how then they speak the same language as the Khoi. That's odd. They have their names of different groups are diminutive versions of the Khoi that live near them. And they have livestock kicking around. So they don't strike me as a purely San hunter-gatherer thing. So one thing that we looked at Dunefield Midden was, of course, we have wild fauna and we have domesticated fauna. And one thing I wanted to know is, are they treated the same way? Right? If they're treated the same way, then they're probably hunter-gatherers, and they bartered for or stole a sheep from a nearby Khoi group. If they're treated differently, then something else is going on. And they're incredibly different. So basically, with the wild fauna, these are large bovid refits. Sorry, small bovid refits, large bovid. So eland and steenbok. Steenbok are these little antelopes like this. Eland are giant. And you can see that most of the refits and bone are happening away from the main domestic area. Again, there's a big exception, which is here, which I'll talk about in just a few minutes. But otherwise, a lot of the bone is refitting not in the domestic zone, not connecting the domestic zone much with the dump. It's really a dump-related type of phenomenon for the most part. And you certainly don't have connections between, maybe one or two, but you don't have a lot of connections between individual hearths. The sheep refits all occur in this southeastern part of the site, and they're extremely tightly structured around this whole constellation of hearths right here. And that is, for me, fascinating. And not only do we have mechanical refits, but we have anatomical refits, which means that because the mechanical refits are you break a bone and two parts fall away and you put them back together, right? But anatomical refits are I take off the left arm of an animal and I take off the right arm of an animal and the two bones match. And anatomical refits are with those it's possible to try to get at sharing, right? Where different parts of the animal are being distributed to different people. And so here we have both mechanical, but we also have anatomical refits. So this is strongly suggestive of food sharing of sheep, two sheep, possibly three, having taken place around this constellation of hearths, okay? And we know that this is something that the Khoi do when there is a special ritual occasion. When the Khoi and to some extent San hunter-gatherers have something to celebrate, life cycle transition, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, they slaughter sheep. And they slaughter sheep around several hearths in a highly structured manner. And they leave the bones in place. They don't move them. That's very important because there's a deity that would like to have the bones. And if you move the bones, it's disrespectful to the deity. It's that same water god that I was talking about a few minutes ago. And that's crucial. Not only that, but a corroborating piece of evidence are these little carnivore burials, which for the Khoi are slaughtered and skinned. They're not eaten. The meat is not touched. They're slaughtered. The skin is taken off and worn as a hat. And so this is an account from an 18th century explorer up in the west coast, a little bit further north of Dunefield Midden, Elands Bay, who said when a woman slaughters, it's called the mongoose slaughter or iab ab. A mongoose is caught and slaughtered by the oldest amongst the women, and the flesh is thrown away except the skin, which the old woman wears on the head like a cap until it is tattered. And this is done to have good luck and not to fall ill. This is a Khoi practice. These bones have extremely clear skinning marks on them. They're telltale, nothing else. Oh, that would be bad. Nothing else creates those kind of marks in the bone modification realm. Skinning marks are some of the least ambiguous, and they all have these very clear skinning marks. So a koi practice in an otherwise hunter-gatherer seeming site strikes both in terms of the carnivores, but also in terms of the highly structured feasting around domestic hearths where the bone was left in place, strongly speaks to not pure koikoin, because there's all sorts of indicators that they look like hunter-gatherers, but hunter-gatherers who had very strong symbolic and ritual and personal relationships with koi people that had moved into that landscape at some point before the occupation of Dunefield Midden. So these are probably hunter-herders. They engaged in low-intensity livestock rearing. They maybe worked for local Khoikhoi people on the landscape. We don't know. It's very difficult to say that. But these are not pure hunter-gatherers in the way that John Parkinson would have recommended. And not only that, but the Khoikhoi, when they came in, they moved into an area between the coast and the interior region, and that would have driven a wedge through coastal and interior San groups. And there's all sorts of other evidence that in the last 1,000 years you get a very heavy coastal tethered signature, very heavy coastal exploitation dietary, and the connections between interior and coastal people in terms of exchange drop off. And so that strikes me as a further indication that we're dealing with a group that was tethered into local pastoralists. Okay, so the last thing is ritual practice discernible at Dunefield Midden? I think absolutely yes. And the reason I think that is two different areas of the site have very weird things going on. One is that area we just saw a minute ago, which doesn't only have these sheep refits all around these hearths, but using the ethnographic and ethnohistoric and historical ethnographic records, we can try to interrogate what that practice might have been. One thing to make clear is that in Khoikhoi and San societies, when a girl has her first menstruation, there is an immediate ritual seclusion. You have to sequester her inside a hut. The hut has to be covered. Rain cannot touch her, water cannot go near her, wind cannot fall on her, because she develops a very paranoid, mystic connection with that water god. This is a god which is a destroyer deity. He's a life giver, he's water, but he's he can be extremely vicious and very dangerous. And if you piss him off, he can carry you away in a whirlwind, he can drown you in a river or lake, hail can fall on you and kill you, all sorts of bad things can happen, and you do not want to piss him off. And he develops a very strong sexual attraction to girls in this state. He falls in love with them and becomes insanely jealous about anyone going near them. And so he's a danger to the rest of the group, and so you have to seclude and recluse the girl until this period, this rite of transition is over. This takes about a month usually. A special hut is built out of the way. Anything associated with water, the range things, including tortoises and ostrich eggshell, are kept away from her. And this whole time is accompanied by highly ritualistic, formalized slaughtering and feasting of sheep, okay, around fires right outside her hut, by women who have already gone through this process, older women that are childbearing of age, the kind of people that girl will be in X number of years, okay? And gifts of beadwork are then given when she comes out of her seclusion and becomes a member of society again after passing through this dangerous liminal phase. Lots of beadwork is lavished on her in her hut. She's given new clothes. Her old stuff is thrown away. Beadwork, and then you have a dance around the hut by various members of the group, and those people are also wearing beads. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Because in this area of highly structured sheep refits in this hearths, we have one hearth in particular with the single largest concentration of ostrich eggshell beads. Over 85% of the ostrich eggshell beads of the entire site, 860 square meters, are concentrated directly around this hearth. These beads, the size of these beads is statistically different from all the other beads at Dunefield Midden. That shows that this is a very tight concentration of sizes, meaning that these almost certainly came off of a single strand of an object, whether it's something like these tassels or a belt or a garner or whatever it is, we don't know. But broke in an event from a strand at a single time. This area is the only area of the site that doesn't have lots of tortoise or ostrich eggshell. They're both very, very deficient in this area, and basically this area alone. And you have, in addition to the sheep refits all around next to this area, kind of gelling with the idea that there was feasting and sharing happening right outside the hut, which would have been around this hearth. You also have a sheep pelvis bang in the middle. This little black dot is a sheep ischium, and one of the traditions in Khoi religion is to cover a sheep pelvis in ochre and hang it up in the huts, in the menstrual huts, as a good fortune and to ward away illness. So I mean, like this, for me, it's quite clear what's happening in this area. That we have, in my opinion, I would maintain a ritualized, sequestered menstrual first menstruation, girls' first menstruation area here at DFM. There's another area that's very interesting. This area I talked about in the far southeast corner of the site, not far from here's the kind of sheep area. I swear to God, this is ending soon. And this is really interesting because this is the highest density of both large and small bovid bones. It's so weird. Why are they all happening at this site? They're also the most networked. Like all the refits, not all of them obviously, but lots of the refits end up here. I was like, what is going on with that area? I could never figure out. It's the kind of thing that, when I first started this, I'm looking at Binford, I'm looking at Bob Brand, I'm looking at all these kind of classic texts, and none of them help. Like, there's nothing like this. And so I'm like, what is happening? And then I start looking at the Blake and Lloyd archive, right, of these Kham hunter-gatherers from the Karoo Desert. And it just goes bang, and it clicks. And basically, long story short is, just like a girl having her first menstruation has a paranoidal link to the water god, so do hunters when they kill an animal, especially eland, which is the single most spiritually charged antelope in the San cosmology and San religion. When they shoot an eland, they suddenly develop a paranormal, sympathetic bond with the animal. And to the point where they basically become the animal. And anything they do can be felt by the animal and vice versa. So when they go back in the camp, they can't be bragging, they can't even talk. They say nothing. They don't eat that night because it'll give the animal strength, right? They try not to urinate because that means the animal will urinate out the poison that they shot into it. They stay away from loud bangs, people banging pots or any of that kind of thing because it'll startle the animal and it'll run away. And not only that, but the main god, this is the creator god, not the destroyer, but the creator god, who's usually equated to a mantis. The most common form he takes is a mantis, praying mantis, called Kagan. His favorite antelope is the eland. He loves it more than anything. He made the eland. It's his thing. So when you shoot an eland, you're seriously pissing off this god. And the god will do anything to cheat you into having that eland escape. It will come into the camp and bite you as a little louse at night. And if you scratch it, it'll freak the eland out and the eland will run. It goes amongst the hunters and try to test the bowstring to see which is the loosest, to who shot the offending shot into his antelope. He'll trick you, he'll deceive you, and in order to avoid that, the actions of the hunter in that stage have to be very, very circumspect and very, very serious. And there's all these different kinds of things they do. And one of the things they do, not just then, but at other times, and this comes straight out of the Blake and Lloyd archive, is they handle the bones with care. And this is not something unique to the San. This is something that, again, you see it in the Arctic. You see it in Australia. You see it in, all sorts of hunter-gatherer records have the same kind of belief systems, that you handle bones nicely. You don't throw them around. Binford talks about these guys, hurling. I don't think that's what was happening, because it would be foolish, because by doing that, you're guaranteeing you're not going to get the next animal next time, because you've pissed it off, because these things are linked. And so there's this wonderful quote from one of the informants back in the 1870s from the Blake and Lloyd archive, is they, meaning the Bushmen, they put the thing's bones nicely aside while they do not throw them about. They put down the bones opposite to the entrance to the hunter's hut. They call it the heap of meat bones. Dream, it's a name, was the one who threw bones upon a heap. Therefore, I did so too. I had married into them. So Dream is the father-in-law of the guy that's telling this to Blake and Lloyd, and they wrote it down. And these heap of meat bones have names. These are very common. They insisted that in the camps of the Kham and the Karoo, they all have, these bones go to a special place, always. You don't throw them around. You take them, you put them on an ostrich breastplate, a breastbone plate, and you take them to a pile and you put them on the pile. right? That's where they go. You don't mess around with them. Children can't mess around with them. Dogs can't eat them. This is where they go. And so to try to understand this highly networked, extremely dense concentration that, by the way, is right outside 3 domestic hearths. Unfortunately, it's at the edge of the site, and they didn't extend it this way. It was like, which would be, I'd love to go back and dig out this, excavate this area, not dig it out, excavate this area to try to figure out what else is going on there. But I think that this is quite strong evidence of the kind of ritual, respectful pile that is, that is being talked about among the Kham hunter-gatherers. Okay, so DFM is an acceptable campsite in terms of preservation, in terms of its brevity, even if it's not a couple weeks, and its horizontal exposure, which is more or less unparalleled, maybe not in the entire world, but one of the largest horizontal exposures of any small-scale hunter-gatherer campsite. Tracing the movement of foodweb residues into, through, and out of the site illuminates the daily rhythms of socio-spatial practice. Not occupied once for just a couple weeks, but multiple times over many months, and that speaks to a structural repetition and memory and placemaking at this site. The inhabitants were probably coast-tethered hunter-herders, not pure hunter-gatherers, with strong links to local pastoralists. The elements of ritual practice discernible in the patterning, including, they are discernible in the patterning, including first menstruation ceremonies and respect behaviors towards non-human, in this case, animal kin. And among animist societies for whom the spiritual and prosaic are indivisible, ritual practice mostly took place at domestic campsites. And therefore, campsites are the foremost arenas of social negotiations, both with other human persons, but also non-human persons. And therefore, I would argue that the key to understanding the evolution of religion lies within them, within the humble, everyday, humdrum domestic campsite. That's where we're going to get it, because of this non-separation between spiritual and prosaic worlds in animist ontologies. So a focus on ontology, and especially I would argue on ecological ontology, can bridge the kind of reductionist and particularist approaches that have characterized the last 60 years of hunter-gatherer archaeology. Oh my God, thank you. So, thanks. Sorry it was long.